The intern stopped me at the door, his eyes raking over my old wool suit. "Ma'am, this is a federal building, not a bingo hall," he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. He saw a lost old woman who didn't belong, but he had no idea he was speaking to Madam Secretary. The taxi meter clicked off with a final digital thunk. I paid the driver in cash, a few worn bills I kept in my coat pocket for just this reason. "Keep the change," I said. The driver grunted, not even looking back. The vinyl seat was cracked and cool against my legs, the air inside the cab thick with the smell of stale coffee and cheap cherry air freshener. I preferred it to a motorcade. A taxi is the luxury of being overlooked, and being overlooked is often a strategic advantage. I stepped out onto the wide, flagstone plaza. The morning air was damp, carrying the metallic scent of car exhaust and the first hints of the city's ambition. I pulled my suit jacket straight. It was an older suit, simple gray wool, but the tailoring was precise. The fabric was soft from years of care. It had been with me in Geneva, in Berlin, and in far dustier, more dangerous places. It was a second skin. My leather briefcase sat heavy in my hand. The handle was worn smooth, shaped to my grip over 30 years. The brass latches were dull. It held my notes for the meeting with Ambassador Thorne, but it also held the weight of a long career. I looked up at the embassy. Glass and steel, it rose up to meet the morning light. It was a formidable-looking building. I remember the groundbreaking, standing in the mud in a hard hat. I was just a junior delegate then, barely 30 years old, fighting to get the project funded. I'd insisted on limestone from a specific domestic quarry. They'd argued for cheaper granite. I won that fight. The stone, now aged 30 years, looked solid, permanent. I smiled. A small, private thing, and walked toward the entrance. My sensible heels made a quiet, firm click-clack on the polished marble floor. The lobby was vast, cathedral quiet, and cold. I could smell floor wax and the faint, sharp tang of the security X-ray machine. It was the scent of federal power, impersonal and clean. Ahead, a few people were queued up for the main security check. To the left, a small brass sign pointed the way. VIP and special appointments. A young man stood behind that desk. He couldn't have been more than 21. His suit was new, a shade too bright, and the shoulders were too wide. It looked like it was wearing him. A crisp plastic name tag was pinned to his lapel. Liam. He was busy looking at his own reflection in the dark screen of his computer. Adjusting the knot of his bright red tie, I stopped a few feet from his desk. He didn't look up. I waited. I've learned to be very, very good at waiting. After a moment, I said, "Good morning." Liam's head snapped up. His eyes sharp, assessing flicked over me. They didn't just see me. They catalogued me. My gray hair pulled back in a simple twist. My face, which I've never bothered to hide the lines on. My wool suit. My old briefcase. A small, unpleasant smirk formed at the corner of his mouth. He put a hand up, palm out, a gesture of absolute dismissal. "Whoa, ma'am, deliveries are in the back." His voice was high and carried, as if he wanted the armed guard standing by the main doors to hear him. I kept my voice level. I didn't move. "I have a 10 o'clock meeting with Ambassador Thorne." The smirk widened. He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the polished desk. "Right." He looked me up and down again, this time slower, making a show of it. "Look," he said, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial sneer. "This is a federal building, not a bingo hall." He paused, waiting for his own joke to land. "The public tours were yesterday." His words hung in the air. "Bingo hall." He meant it as an insult. He thought age was a weakness. He thought simplicity was poverty. I felt a familiar, tired ache settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Just ... disappointment. This building, this embassy, was meant to represent the best of us. I let the silence sit for a beat. I let him enjoy his own cleverness. He was so young, all sharp, brittle confidence. He saw my clothes. He saw my age. He didn't see me. I've been dismissed by men with more power than he could ever imagine. This was just noise. I stood up a little straighter. My voice was quiet, but I knew it would cut through the lobby's hush. "Young man, my name is Eleanor Vance. Please check your list." Liam let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a terrible sound, dry and brittle. He tapped a finger against his temple. "Eleanor Vance. Got it?" He turned to his computer with a great theatrical sigh, as if I was the heaviest burden he had to carry all week. He didn't use a mouse. He just tapped one key, then another, his fingernails making a loud clack-clack onto plastic. The sound was too loud in the quiet lobby. I waited. I stood perfectly still. I did not lean on the desk. I did not shift my weight. I just held my briefcase and watched him. "Right," he said, drawing the word out. He squinted at the screen. A performance of deep, careful searching. "Let's see here. VANCEE." He stopped typing and hummed, a tuneless, mocking sound. "Nope," he announced, popping the P sound. He spun the monitor so I couldn't see it, then leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. The chair let out a long, protesting squeak. "No Eleanor on the list." "Sorry." I held his gaze. "Perhaps you should check again. The meeting is with Ambassador Thorne. He is expecting me." The mention of the ambassador's name seemed to annoy him. His smile tightened. "Oh, I do have a Secretary Vance on the list," he said, his voice full of fake brightness. "A very important meeting at 10, but ... He let his eyes do the talking. He looked at my simple gray suit, at my worn briefcase, at the lines on my face. "THAT's obviously not you," he finished. The insult was precise. It was designed to hurt, to diminish, to make me feel small and foolish. He believed I was an imposter, a confused old woman who had wandered into a world where she didn't belong. He was so sure of his judgment. "Ma'am," he said, his voice shifting. He was done with the game. Now he was the man in charge. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. As I said, this is a secure federal building. If you don't move, I will have to call security." He nodded his head toward the real security guard, the man in the blue uniform standing by the main doors. I glanced at the guard. He was a man my age, maybe a few years younger. He had the quiet, weary eyes of a career professional. He was watching us, his face neutral, but his stance was relaxed. He hadn't unhooked the radio from his belt. He hadn't shifted his feet. He was annoyed, not by me, but by Liam's loud, unnecessary drama. He knew a threat when he saw one. I was not a threat. I turned back to Liam, the clock on the wall behind him. A big, official-looking clock read 9:59 a.m. "You will not call security," I said. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. Liam's face flushed a dark, blotchy red. The color rose from his stiff white collar. He was furious that I wasn't backing down, that I wasn't flustered or frightened. He was used to people obeying the desk. "That's it," he snapped. He reached for the phone on his desk. "I'm calling security. You're trespassing." "I am standing on a marble floor in a public lobby," I corrected him, my voice still quiet. "I am not trespassing. I am waiting. Waiting for what?" He spat, his hand hovering over the phone. I looked at the clock. The long, black, second hand swept up toward the 12. 10 a.m. "For the ambassador," I said. Liam scoffed and finally snatched the phone receiver, jamming it against his ear. "Right? The ambassador?" He turned his back to me slightly, a final, childish gesture of dismissal. I let him make the call. I let him do his job. I just stood there, grounded in my own certainty, and waited. I've waited for cabinet ministers, for ceasefire agreements, and for stubborn old men to see reason. Waiting for an intern to finish his tantrum was nothing. Liam was still holding the phone, his back to me, speaking in a low, important-sounding voice. "Yes, I have a disruptive individual." At the VIP desk, he didn't get to finish. A loud hiss of hydraulics was followed by the bang of the main security doors opening with enough force to echo off the marble. A rush of footsteps followed. Not the measured tread of a visitor, but the quick, frantic sound of someone in a hurry, someone in a panic. Liam turned, the phone still pressed to his ear. Ambassador Thomas Thorne burst into the lobby. I'd known Thomas for 20 years. He was a good man, always a little too anxious, but steady. Now he looked wrecked. His face was pale and slick with sweat. He was in his late 50s, but at this moment he looked much older. His silver tie was crooked. He was not alone. 2 aides, a young man and a young woman, scrambled behind him, their arms full of binders and iPads. They looked just as terrified as he did. "Sir, she's not, ... double quotes, the male aide panted. I know, Thomas snapped, his eyes darting wildly around the lobby, scanning the queue at the main security line. "Check the entrance." Oh God! Liam, seeing the ambassador, suddenly came alive. His face lit up. He clearly thought this was his moment, that the ambassador had rushed down to deal with me. He puffed up his chest, the new suit jacket straining at the buttons. He hung up the phone with a decisive click. He stepped out from behind the desk, taking a proprietary stance in the middle of the floor. "Mr. Ambassador, sir," Liam called out, his voice high and reedy. "Don't worry, I'm handling this. This woman refuses to." The ambassador's head snapped in the direction of the voice. His eyes, frantic and searching, finally found me. The change was instant. The panic in his face didn't just stop. It was replaced by something else. A profound, bone-deep, flooding wave of relief. It was so total, it looked like he might collapse. "Oh, thank God," he breathed. He didn't walk. He moved. He completely ignored Liam, brushing past him so fast the intern had to stumble backward to avoid being knocked over. Thomas stopped a foot in front of me. He was still breathing hard. But he was already straightening his tie, smoothing his jacket. Pulling himself into the formal shape of his office, he looked at my face, then at my old wool suit, and his eyes filled with a pained, apologetic understanding. He knew exactly what had happened. He gave a short, formal bow, a dip of the head and shoulders. It was the kind of gesture one reserves for visiting heads of state. "Madam Secretary," he said, and his voice was full of breathless, genuine deference. "My deepest apologies. We had your arrival time for 10:05. Our fault entirely." He gestured to the secure area. "We are so honored you are here. The delegation is waiting." He paused and added, "We are ready for you." The lobby, which had been quiet before, was now completely, utterly silent. I could hear the faint whir of the security camera panning overhead. I looked past Thomas. The real security guard, the older man by the main doors, was no longer relaxed. He was standing at a perfect, rigid position of attention. I turned my gaze back to Thomas. I let a small, warm smile touch my lips. "Thomas," I said, my voice calm, "it's good to see you. Let's not keep them waiting." Yes, of course," he stammered, his body sagging with relief. He motioned for me to go first. I took a step, and then I paused. I had to walk past the desk. I had to walk past Liam. He was still standing in the middle of the floor, frozen. The blood had drained from his face. His skin was the color of wet paper. His mouth was open, but no sound was coming out. He was staring at me, but his eyes were blank. He wasn't seeing me anymore. He was seeing the smoking wreck of his future. I walked past him. I did not look at him again. I did not say a word. I didn't need to. His own ambition, his own arrogance had delivered a judgment far more complete than any I could offer. I followed Thomas. The 2 aides scrambled to open the secure elevator, their hands shaking. I stepped inside, my old leather briefcase still in my hand. The doors, polished steel, began to slide shut, reflecting the cold, perfect light of the lobby and the small, shattered figure I was leaving behind. An hour later, the elevator doors slid open with a soft, mechanical sigh. The sound was smooth, respectful. The meeting had been difficult, but productive. Budgets, staffing, a complex new policy initiative, the usual work of running things. The delegation, a collection of senior attaches and department heads, had been tense when I entered. Now they were relieved. We had a plan. I stepped out onto the polished marble, my briefcase feeling a little lighter in my hand. Ambassador Thorne walked beside me, his entire posture different. He was no longer the panicked, frantic man from the lobby. He was relaxed, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his face clear. The crisis was over. The real work was done. Honestly, Eleanor, Thomas was saying, his voice warm and full of genuine relief. I don't know how you did it. The way you handled the appropriations question, it was brilliant. You saved us 6 months of gridlock. I gave a small shrug. You had all the right data, Thomas. You just needed someone to make the final call. You've trained your staff well. They're sharp. They're terrified of you, he said, but he was smiling. They're respectful of the office. I corrected him gently. As they should be. And you're doing a fine job, Thomas. Don't let them see you sweat so much. He chuckled, a real full laugh that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. That's why you're Madam Secretary and I'm just an ambassador. You never sweat. Oh, I sweat, I said, thinking of a few very hot, very dusty negotiations in rooms with no air conditioning. I just don't let it show. We walked together, our footsteps clicking in a comfortable, easy rhythm. The lobby was as it was before. The same sharp smell of floor wax. The same cold, indifferent light pouring in from the high windows. The same armed guard stood at his post by the main doors. But everything felt different. I was no longer an anonymous old woman in a wool suit. I was just ... me. Walking through a building I helped build, having just finished a job I was trained to do. It was a good feeling. Simple, satisfying. We were halfway to the main entrance, our conversation turning to his family, his wife's garden, when my eye was drawn to the side, over by the wall. Near the main exit, but tucked away as if to be hidden, I saw him dot Liam the name. The sight of him brought the morning's unpleasantness back with a sudden, sharp jolt. It was like finding a small, sour grape in a bowl of sweet fruit. He was no longer at the VIP desk. That post was now manned by a sharp-looking woman in a crisp. Blue uniform. Liam was just ... standing. He was pressed against the wall, his shoulders hunched, his bright, new suit looking rumpled and wrong. He wasn't alone. A senior staffer, a woman I recognized from the meeting named Ms. Davies, was standing in front of him. Her back was to me, but I could see the rigid line of her shoulders. She was speaking to him. Her voice was too low to hear, but her body language was unmistakable. It was a cold, quiet, methodical fury. Liam was not looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the floor. His face, which I could see in profile, was pale and still. The arrogant, mocking smirk was gone. He just looked young and small and utterly, completely broken. Ms. Davies, the senior staffer, must have felt our presence. Her shoulders tensed, and she stopped speaking to Liam in mid-sentence. She turned her head, slowly. Her eyes met mine. Then they flicked to the ambassador beside me. Her professional composure cracked. A look of pure, unadulterated horror washed over her face. She was mortified. The ambassador and I, walking together, laughing, had just stumbled right into her disciplinary action. "Mr. Ambassador, Madam Secretary," she stammered. She looked like she wanted the marble floor to open up and swallow her. Ambassador Thorne's good humor vanished instantly. His face hardened. He looked at Ms. Davies, then at the cowering intern, and then back to me. He was angry, not at me, but at the entire, ugly, unprofessional mess. He opened his mouth, and I knew he was about to say something sharp, something that would scorch the intern and embarrass Ms. Davies. I put a hand on his arm. Just a light touch. "Thomas," I said quietly. He stopped. He looked at me, his jaw tight. He understood. This was not his mess to clean up, and a public reprimand from him would only make things worse. He gave a short, stiff nod. I dropped my hand. He would wait for me by the door. But I wasn't ready to leave. I turned and began to walk, not toward the exit, but toward the intern. Each step was quiet, deliberate. Ms. Davies looked panicked, unsure if she should stay or go. Liam, who had been staring at the floor, looked up as my dark, sensible heels stopped a few feet in front of him. He flinched. His eyes were red. He looked at me, and this time he finally saw me. He saw the power he had failed to recognize, and he was terrified. He looked like a small boy, waiting for a final, crushing blow. I looked at him for a long moment. I let the silence stretch. I wanted him to remember this silence. "What is your name?" I asked. My voice was not angry. It was just clear and firm. "Liam," he whispered. His voice was raw. "Liam," I repeated, tasting the name. "Ms. Davies, how long has he been with you?" Ms. Davies stepped forward, her professionalism clicking back into place. Though her hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. 3 weeks, Madam Secretary. He's from the summer intern program, I see." I turned my full attention back to the intern. He was trembling, just slightly. "A word of advice, young man," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the lobby's hush. Liam, Ms. Davies, and Ambassador Thorne, who waited by the door, were the only people in my world. "In this line of work," I continued, "we are in the business of people. We don't trade in stocks or build things with our hands. We trade in trust. We build relationships." Liam just stared, his eyes wide, his mouth parted. "We judge people," I said, "by their actions and their character, not by their wardrobe, not by their age or their car or the briefcase they carry." I glanced down at my own worn leather case, then met his gaze again. "You see? Fashion fades," I said, using his own shallow metric against him. "Flashy, new things. They get old. They get replaced." I paused, letting the words sink in. He was listening. He was finally listening. "But substance, ... substance lasts. Character lasts. It's the only thing that matters in this building. It's the only thing that matters in the world." He swallowed, a painful-looking movement in his thin throat. I had said my piece. I had not yelled. I had not demanded he be fired. I had simply given him the truth. The rest was up to him and to Ms. Davies. I looked at Ms. Davies. "A pleasure to see you again." "Madam Secretary," she said, her voice full of respect. I nodded once. A final, clean dismissal. I turned my back on Liam and walked away. I walked across the remaining few yards of marble toward Thomas, who was holding the door open for me. I didn't look back to see the intern's face. I didn't need to. I had closed that file. I stepped out of the cold, air-conditioned lobby and into the warm, bright, messy air of the city. I walked away from the embassy, across the wide flagstone plaza. The sun was higher now, and the air had lost its damp morning chill. It felt warm on my face. Ambassador Thorne had offered me a car, of course. A black, official car with flags and a driver. I declined. "The walk will do me good, Thomas," I'd said. He understood. He knew I valued my independence, my ability to move through the world on my own terms. I stood at the curb, just another woman in a gray suit waiting for a ride. The street was busy. Cars rushed past, a river of steel and glass, each one carrying someone important to their own private meeting. After a minute, an ordinary yellow taxi its light on, pulled over. I opened the door and slid in. The vinyl seat was warm from the sun. This cab smelled faintly of cinnamon gum and old newspapers. It was a comfortable, anonymous smell. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. He was an older man, his hair white, his face a map of wrinkles. I gave him my home address. He just nodded, flicked the meter on, and pulled us into the flow of traffic. I placed the leather briefcase on my lap. My hands rested on top of it, my fingers tracing the familiar, worn grooves of the handle. The meeting had gone well. The policy was sound. The staff at the embassy were bright. Thomas, for all his anxiety, was a good leader. The work was good. The work was solid. My mind, unbidden, drifted back to the lobby. To the intern, Liam. I didn't feel angry. Not anymore. The sharp, sour feeling of being dismissed had faded, replaced by a quiet, heavy sadness. I'd seen that look on a young face before, that combination of arrogance and complete, hollow insecurity. He was so busy trying to look the part that he had forgotten to be the part. He wanted to be in a building of power. He had no idea that the power wasn't in the building, or the desk, or the suit. The power was in the work, in the substance. I thought about my suit. This old gray wool. I remembered when I bought it at a small tailor shop in London 30 years ago. I had just finished a very difficult, very long negotiation. It had been my first major assignment. I'd bought the suit with my own money as a celebration. A reminder that I had earned my place. The tailor, an old man with pins in his cuff, had told me, "This is good cloth, Miss. It will last. You take care of it, it will take care of you." He was right. It had lasted. It had been my armor and my uniform. It had been with me. Liam's suit, so new and stiff, was a costume. He was playing a role. He thought power was a costume you put on. He didn't understand that you have to build it from the inside out, piece by piece, year by year. You have to earn it. The taxi slowed, turning off the main, loud avenue and onto the quieter, tree-lined streets of my neighborhood. The light changed. The car, the noise, the city. It all felt very far away from the cold marble of the embassy. I looked out the window. Children were playing in a small park. An elderly couple walked hand in hand, their steps slow and even. My neighborhood was not grand. It was not impressive. The houses were brick and wood, solid and unassuming. They had good roofs and neat gardens. It was a place where substance mattered more than style. The driver pulled up to my curb, in front of my simple brick house. It was a house, not an estate. It had a small garden in the front where my peonies were just starting to show color. "Here you are, ma'am," the driver said. I paid him, adding a good tip. "Thank you for the quiet ride." "Have a good day," he said, his eyes kind. I stepped out of the cab, briefcase in hand. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The air smelled like cut grass and warm earth. It was the smell of home. Liam would never have noticed this house. He would have driven right past it, looking for something bigger, shinker. He would have dismissed it, just as he had dismissed me. I smiled, a real, full smile this time. I was glad he wasn't here. I was glad he didn't know where I lived. This was my place, a place built on a different set of values. A place I had earned, too. I put my key in the lock. The brass was warm from the afternoon sun. The lock turned with a smooth, oiled click-a sound I had heard every day for 40 years. I stepped inside. The embassy lobby had smelled of cold marble and floor wax. My house smelled of lemon oil, old books, and the faint, sweet scent of the tea roses I'd cut last weekend. The air was warm. Here, the silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was the sound of my life, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the old wooden floorboards under my feet. I slipped off my sensible heels and left them by the door. wiggling my toes. I slid my feet into the soft, worn leather slippers waiting on the mat. They were old, comfortable, and shaped perfectly to my feet. I walked down the hall and set my briefcase on the heavy oak console table. I, unclass, ped the dull brass latches snap. Snaphand took out the day's files. The meeting notes were done. The policy was set. The case was closed. I placed the empty briefcase back on the floor in its usual spot by the table. Its job was over for the day. I went into the kitchen. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window over the sink, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I filled my old whistling kettle with water and set it on the stove. While I waited, I went to my closet. I took off the gray wool jacket. The fabric felt solid and reliable in my hands. I thought of Liam's words, old clothes. I looked at the seams, still perfect after 3 decades. I remembered the old tailor, his mouth full of pins, telling me, good cloth will last. He was right. This suit had never let me down. It had never tried to be anything other than what it was. Well-made, simple, and functional. I hung it up carefully, smoothing the shoulders so it would be ready for the next time I needed it. I unhooked my pearls and put them back in their small velvet box, in the kitchen. The kettle began to sing. A low hum, then a rising, insistent whistle. I poured the boiling water into my favorite mug. It was a heavy ceramic one, a deep blue, with a small chip on the rim that I knew by feel. I dropped in a simple tea bag. I didn't need anything fancy. I just needed the warmth. I carried my tea into the living room and sat down in my chair. It's a big, overstuffed armchair upholstered in a faded floral fabric. It has held me at the end of many long, hard days. I looked around the room. It was not a room from a magazine. The shelves were full of books, some stacked too deep. There were photographs on the mantelpiece, crowding each other. Me, young, standing in the mud at the embassy groundbreaking. My late husband, Robert, his arm around my shoulder, his laugh lines deep. My grandchildren, frozen in the middle of a chaotic, joyful game. This was my life. Not the steel and glass, not the formal meetings, not the title. This, the books, the memories, the solid, quiet comfort of a life built piece by piece. I thought of Liam one last time. I pictured his pale, shocked face. He had been so wrong. He thought power was a bright, new suit and a loud voice. He thought it was about who you could stop at a door. He didn't understand. Power isn't about stopping people. It's about starting things. It's about getting the funding for the building in the first place. It's about sitting at the table, finding the solution, and doing the hard, quiet work, day after day, year after year. That's substance. It's not flashy. It's not new. It's the work that lasts. It's the foundation, the old suit, the house that holds you. I took a sip of my tea. It was hot, simple, and good. The house was quiet. The work was done. And I was home.